They called her a paper soldier the second she walked in. Said she probably fought more keyboards than enemies. But when the tape on her wrist slipped, and the major saw the 9 burned-in kill marks, she wasn't trying to show off. The room got quiet, because those weren't just stories, and she wasn't just a name. She was the reason their rotation even existed. Want to know what those marks really meant? And why 3 cocky reservists learned the hardest lesson of their military careers? Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The sun hadn't fully cleared the fence line when Sergeant Lorna Briggs pushed through the double doors of Building 9. The Joint Base Gym at Fort Brennan smelled like industrial disinfectant and old sweat, that peculiar cocktail of ambition and regulation that hung in every military fitness facility. From Bragg to Benning, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that harsh white glow that made everyone look either younger or older than they really were. Never quite right. At 42, Briggs moved with the kind of economy that comes from 2 decades of making every step count. Her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail beneath a faded army cap, and she wore a PT shirt that had been washed so many times the logo was barely visible. The fabric was soft, worn thin in places, but still held the ghost of military creases. Her boots weren't regulation shiny, but they were broken in properly, the leather shaped by miles of movement across terrain that didn't appear on any training manual. She carried herself differently than most of the weekend warriors who filtered through these doors. No swagger, no need to announce her presence, just purposeful quiet, like someone who'd learned that the loudest person in the room was usually the one who hadn't earned the right to speak. Behind the front desk, Corporal Martinez barely glanced up from his tablet, fingers moving across a digital roster with the bored efficiency of someone pulling weekend duty. The morning sun slanted through windows that needed cleaning, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stale air. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with the morning's duty assignments. "Sign-in's electronic now," Martinez mumbled, pointing to a fingerprint scanner that looked like it had survived 3 budget cycles. "Press your thumb and wait for green." Briggs stepped forward and placed her thumb on the pad. The light flickered, then held steady green. Martinez did a double take at the name that appeared on his screen, squinting like he was trying to place something that felt familiar, but just out of reach. "You on the sparring roster?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "Was told I was cleared for it," she said, her tone matter of fact. Not defensive, not aggressive, just stating a fact. Martinez scrolled through his screen, shrugged when he couldn't find any obvious problems, and waved her through. "Main floor's open. Equipment checkout's on the left if you need gear." She nodded once and walked through the security gate, her duffel swinging slightly with each step. The sound of her boots on the polished concrete echoed briefly, then was swallowed by the ambient noise of a base coming to life. Inside the main gym, morning light filtered through high windows, creating long rectangles of gold across the sparring mats. The air was cooler here, circulated by industrial fans that had been humming since before dawn. Free weights clanked in steady rhythm as early risers worked through their routines, and the smell of rubber matting, mixed with the faint scent of cleaning solution, applied too liberally the night before. Near the weight bench, 3 reservists stood in that loose cluster formation that spoke of familiarity and shared contempt for anything resembling real work. Spence, Tolliver, and Darren, all in their late 20s, all carrying themselves with the particular brand of confidence that came from being the biggest fish in a very small pond. They had the lean builds of men who worked out regularly, but had never had to carry a wounded teammate across hostile terrain. The kind of fitness that looked good in photos, but had never been tested beyond the comfortable limits of a training schedule. Spence caught sight of her first, his eyes tracking her movement across the gym floor with the lazy interest of someone looking for entertainment. Well, check this out. New blood, or someone's mom got lost looking for the commissary? Tolliver grinned, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. Definitely logistics. Look at those sleeves. Bet she files reports about push-ups instead of doing them. Darren snorted, lifting a weight with more show than purpose. Total paper soldier vibes. Probably has a certificate for typing speed hanging in her cubicle. They laughed. The kind of easy, casual laughter that men use when they think they're being clever and no one important is listening. The sound carried across the gym, mixing with the clank of equipment and the steady thrum of air circulation. Briggs set her duffel down near the corner wall, unzipping it with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. She pulled out hand wraps, plain black cloth, nothing fancy or regulation issued, just functional gear that had been used enough to be soft and pliable. She began wrapping her wrists with practiced efficiency, each loop placed exactly where it needed to be, building layers of protection with movements so automatic they could have been performed in complete darkness. As she worked, the compression sleeves on her forearm shifted slightly, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath. The skin was marked, not with tattoos, not with decorative ink, but with something else entirely. Thin vertical lines, precise and uniform, burned into the flesh with the kind of permanence that spoke of ritual and significance. Spence noticed the motion, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "Hey, Grandma," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured friendliness that masked contempt. "This isn't exactly a senior center fitness class." Briggs continued rapping, not bothering to look up. "Good thing," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise with surprising clarity. "Those are usually too easy." Tolliver laughed, but the sound had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Okay, that's cute. But seriously, this is combatives training. Little more intense than chair yoga." She finished with her left wrist and started on her right. The movement still automatic, still precise. "I wasn't planning to sit down." The response hung in the air for a moment, creating a small pocket of tension that the three men weren't quite sure how to navigate. They exchanged glances, each waiting for the others to take the lead in what was beginning to feel less like entertainment and more like something that might require actual thought. Darren tried to regain the initiative, stepping forward with the kind of exaggerated swagger that men use when they're starting to feel uncertain. "Look, lady, no disrespect, but you might be in over your head here. This isn't exactly beginner's night." Briggs looked up for the first time since entering the gym, her eyes meeting his with the kind of steady, unblinking gaze that made him suddenly aware of how young he sounded. Then it should be interesting. As she adjusted the wrap on her right wrist, the compression sleeve shifted again, revealing more of those vertical marks. They weren't random. Each line was exactly the same width, the same spacing, burned into the skin with surgical precision. Darren caught a glimpse of them and felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What's with the wrist art?" he asked, trying to inject sarcasm into his voice, but hearing it come out smaller than intended. Tolliver leaned in for a better look, his expression shifting from amusement to something approaching unease. "Kill count?" he said, but the joke fell flat even as he said it. "What, you watch too much Netflix and decide to give yourself some street cred?" Briggs finished adjusting her wrap and stood, her movements fluid and controlled. She looked at the three of them for a moment, and something in her expression, not anger, not annoyance, just a kind of patient assessment, made them all suddenly aware that they were in the middle of something they didn't understand. "Let me know when you want to find out what they really mean," she said, turning toward the sparring mats, with the kind of calm confidence that left no room for interpretation. They were still laughing, But the sound had changed. It was smaller now, less certain. Like men whistling past a graveyard, they suddenly realized they might have to walk through. The sparring area occupied the center of the gym, marked off by regulation mats that had been taped down with military precision. The surface was clean and level, surrounded by enough space for spectators and the inevitable crowd that gathered whenever someone thought they had something to prove. Morning light streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows that would shift and change as the day progressed. But for now, everything was illuminated with the clear, honest light of dawn. Briggs stepped onto the mat and began her warm-up routine. Nothing flashy, nothing designed for show, just the basic movements that kept a body functional. Jump rope at a steady, hypnotic rhythm that spoke of muscle memory carved over years. Shoulder rolls, neck rotations, deep squats that revealed a flexibility most people half her age couldn't match. Every motion was economical, purposeful, the kind of preparation that suggested she'd done this before in places where being ready wasn't optional. At the weight bench, Tolliver elbowed Spence in the ribs. "Look at this. She's doing middle school PE warm-ups. This is going to be embarrassing." Spence grinned, but it felt forced now. Probably pulled something just thinking about contact sports. Staff Sergeant Delaney emerged from the equipment room carrying his ever-present clipboard, the tool of his trade as gym coordinator. He was built like a fire plug, broad, solid, and immovable, with the kind of face that didn't waste energy on unnecessary expressions. He'd been running this gym for 3 years, had seen every type of soldier, from green recruits to crusty veterans, and had developed an eye for trouble that rarely missed its mark. "We're opening live sparring rotation," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the gym floor. "Sign-ups on the board, light contact only. Respect rank and regulations. Anyone who can't follow those rules can find somewhere else to work out their aggression." Briggs finished her warm-up and walked over to the sign-up board, taking the pen attached by a chain and writing her name at the top of the list. Her handwriting was neat, precise, the kind developed by someone who'd filled out countless forms in less than ideal conditions. Delaney glanced at the board and raised an eyebrow. "You cleared for this?" She met his gaze directly. "Yes, Sergeant." Her tone wasn't arrogant or challenging. It was simply absolute, the voice of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of and felt no need to justify it to anyone else. Spence had drifted over during the exchange, close enough to read the board over Delaney's shoulder. "She actually signed up," he said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "This should be good." Briggs turned to face him, and something in her expression, still calm, still controlled, but with an edge of anticipation, made him suddenly aware that he might have stepped into something larger than he'd intended. "You're welcome to test whatever theories you've been developing," she said. The challenge was offered quietly, without heat or bravado, but it landed with the weight of certainty. Spence felt his grin falter slightly, then forced it back into place with an effort that fooled no one, least of all himself. "All right, Grandma," he said, the nickname feeling less clever than it had 10 minutes earlier. "Let's see what you've got." Delaney looked between them, his expression suggesting he was beginning to suspect this wouldn't end the way the younger man expected. "Don't embarrass the uniform," he said, but it wasn't clear which of them he was addressing. They squared off in the center of the mat, and the difference between them became immediately apparent. Spence bounced on his toes, rolled his shoulders, went through an elaborate stretching routine designed more for show than function. He moved like someone who'd learned fighting from movies and training videos, all flash and energy without the underlying foundation of someone who'd ever had to use these skills for anything more serious than weekend bragging rights. Briggs simply stood there, relaxed but ready, her weight distributed evenly, hands loose at her sides. She wasn't tense, wasn't coiled for action. She was just present, in the moment, with the kind of stillness that suggested she could explode into motion or remain perfectly calm with equal ease. "Go easy on me," Spence said, still grinning, still playing to his audience of two. The timer started. For the first few seconds, Spence danced around her, throwing light jabs that were designed more to establish range than to do damage. He was testing her, looking for reactions, trying to read her style, but Briggs didn't give him anything to read. She simply tracked his movement, shifting her weight slightly to maintain optimal positioning, watching with the kind of attention that suggested she was cataloging everything he showed her. When he finally committed to a real attack, a quick hook that was meant to demonstrate his speed and skill, she moved. The response was so fluid, so economical, that observers would later disagree about exactly what they'd seen. One moment Spence was throwing his punch, confident in his technique and timing. The next, he was airborne, his balance destroyed by a hip throw that used his own momentum against him. He hit the mat with a sound that carried clearly across the gym, the air forced from his lungs in a sharp exhalation that spoke of genuine surprise. The room went quiet. Spence lay there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. When he finally rolled to his feet, he was no longer grinning. "Okay," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Lucky shot." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Nothing about what had just happened felt like luck. It felt like precision, like experience, like someone who'd done this before when the stakes were considerably higher. Then weekend bragging rights. They squared off again, and this time Spence was more careful, more respectful of her reach and positioning. He tried a different approach, a shoulder charge designed to use his size and strength advantage to overwhelm her defensive posture. Briggs sidestepped the charge with minimal effort, hooked his leading leg as he passed, and sent him sprawling across the mat in a controlled fall that left him flat on his back with her knee on his chest and his wrist twisted at an angle that made his shoulder protest loudly. "Tap," she said, her voice calm and conversational. Spence slapped the mat 3 times in rapid succession, and she released him immediately, stepping back to give him room to recover. He sat up slowly, working his shoulder, and trying to understand how someone who looked like a middle-aged office worker had just dismantled him twice in less than 2 minutes. What the hell was that? Delaney looked down at him with the expression of someone who'd seen this particular lesson taught many times before. That was not beginner's luck. Tolliver and Darren had gone quiet, their earlier amusement replaced by something approaching respect, or at least the beginning of understanding that they might have misjudged the situation. Briggs walked to the edge of the mat and took a sip from her water bottle, her breathing steady and controlled, showing no signs of exertion from the brief encounter. Spence got to his feet and looked at her for a long moment, trying to reconcile what he'd just experienced with his assumptions about who she was and what she represented. "You still think she's here for paperwork?" he asked Tolliver. But the question lacked his earlier confidence. The room had shifted. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by a tension that came from the recognition that they were in the presence of something they didn't understand. Briggs adjusted her wrist wraps with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. And as she did, the compression sleeves shifted again, revealing more of those precise vertical marks burned into her skin. The lesson had begun, but none of them realized yet just how much they still had to learn. The gym's main door opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, and Major Kendall Hayes stepped inside. At 54, he moved with the kind of controlled purpose that came from 3 decades of military service, most of it spent in places that didn't appear on tourist maps. His uniform was pressed, but not parade ground perfect. The creases sharp but functional rather than ceremonial. He carried a clipboard and moved with the efficient rhythm of an officer making his morning rounds, fitness compliance checks, personnel evaluations, the endless administrative machinery that kept a base running smoothly. Hayes paused just inside the door, his trained eye automatically cataloging the room's atmosphere. Something was off. The usual morning banter was missing, replaced by a tension he could feel even from across the gym. Near the water cooler, Spence sat with a towel around his neck, working his shoulder with the careful movements of someone who'd been introduced to pain they hadn't expected. Tolliver and Darren leaned against the wall, their earlier swagger replaced by something approaching wariness. And on the mat, a woman sat calmly adjusting her wrist wraps, her attention focused on the task with the kind of single-minded concentration that spoke of ritual and habit rather than nervous energy. Hayes walked over to Delaney, who was studying his clipboard with the expression of someone trying to make sense of what he just witnessed. "What's the situation here, Sergeant?" Hayes asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people pay attention without raising the volume. Delaney handed him the clipboard without looking up. "Had an unexpected addition to the sparring roster. Woman signed herself in, said she was cleared." Hayes scanned the list, his pen stopping mid-motion when he reached a particular name. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough for someone who knew how to read faces to notice that something significant had just clicked into place. "Briggs?" he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Yeah," Delaney confirmed. "You know her?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up at the woman on the mat, studying her with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for serious problems or unexpected opportunities. She was pulling back one of her wrist wraps, adjusting the tension, and as she did, her compression sleeve shifted enough to reveal what lay beneath. The marks were unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Not tattoos, not decorative ink, but something else entirely. Vertical lines burned into the skin with surgical precision, each one exactly the same width and spacing. Hayes counted 9 visible marks, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as the implications settled in his mind. He'd seen marks like that before, in classified briefings he wasn't supposed to remember, in after-action reports that officially didn't exist. They belonged to a different era, a time when certain units operated under rules that were written in blood, rather than regulation, manuals. Tolliver, still trying to process what he'd witnessed during the sparring session, called across the room with forced bravado. "She's got those things all over her arms. Real dramatic. Like some kind of warrior priestess wannabe." The words hit the air and died there, smothered by the weight of Hayes' sudden attention. When the major spoke, his voice cut through the ambient noise of the gym like a blade through cloth. "Do you boys have any idea what you're looking at?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It was the kind of inquiry that demanded an answer, the sort of challenge that separated those who knew what they were talking about from those who were simply making noise. Tolliver blinked, suddenly aware that he'd wandered into territory he didn't understand. What? The fake war paint? Spence shifted uncomfortably. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Darren found urgent business examining his shoelaces. Hayes walked toward Briggs, his movement deliberate and respectful. "Mind if I ask where you're stationed these days, Sergeant?" She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. There was no deference in her posture, but no challenge either. Just the steady regard of one professional addressing another. "Off the grid. Civilian contractor status was reinstated 8 months ago." Hayes nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle falling into place in his mind. "They finally cleared your paperwork?" "Enough to walk back through doors like this one," she said, gesturing slightly toward the gym around them. He turned back to the 3 younger men who were watching this exchange with growing unease. The casual atmosphere of the morning had been replaced by something heavier, more serious. Like the moment when you realize you've been swimming in water deeper than you thought. "Those marks you've been joking about," Hayes said, his voice carrying easily across the room. They're not decoration. They're not some kind of tough guy accessory you pick up at a tattoo parlor. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Each one represents a confirmed elimination on a mission that never officially happened. That's not ink, that's scar tissue, made the way certain echo teams used to mark their confirmed kills, when traditional tattoos wouldn't survive the conditions they operated in, but fire would leave a permanent record. The gym had gone completely silent. Even the background noise of other personnel working out seemed muted, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Sergeant Briggs ran point for 3rd Reconnaissance, Group 7, deep insertion, non-attributed operations, black budget missions in places that don't exist on your training maps. Tolliver's face had gone pale. Wait, like actual combat? No, Hayes said dryly. Like actual war. The kind where people die if you make mistakes. He gestured toward the marks on her arms, still partially visible beneath the shifted compression sleeves. 9 confirmed kills. That's 9 people who were breathing when she encountered them and weren't breathing when she left. And that's just the documented ones. Spence looked down at his hands, suddenly aware of how small his weekend warrior problems really were. You think they let her walk in here and sign up for sparring matches because they're feeling nostalgic? Hayes continued. She's got more confirmed enemy kills than most infantry companies see in an entire deployment. He took a breath, his gaze sweeping across the 3 men who had spent the morning learning a lesson they hadn't expected. The woman you've been calling Grandma and Paper Soldier has more combat experience than the 3 of you combined will accumulate in your entire military careers, even if you each serve 20 years and see action in every conflict between now and retirement. Briggs had finished adjusting her wraps and was quietly packing her gear back into the duffel bag. She hadn't said a word during Hayes' explanation, hadn't felt the need to defend herself or elaborate on her service record. Her silence spoke louder than any boast or explanation could have. Darren finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended. We didn't know. No, Hayes agreed. You didn't. And that's the first real lesson you've learned today. He looked at each of them in turn, his expression serious but not unkind. In the military, you never know who you're talking to. That clerk who processes your paperwork might be a former Ranger. That mechanic working on your vehicle might have survived 3 tours in Afghanistan. That quiet woman minding her own business might have skills that would keep you alive in situations you can't even imagine. Hayes turned back to Briggs, who had shouldered her duffel and was preparing to leave. "Sergeant," he called out, his voice carrying a note of professional respect. She paused at the threshold, one foot already headed toward the door. "Still sharp," he said. Briggs looked back briefly, and for the first time that morning, something that might have been a smile flickered across her face. "Rust was never the problem," she said, and with that, she walked out, leaving behind a room full of people who had learned something important about assumptions, respect, and the difference between playing soldier and being one. The silence stretched for several seconds after the door closed behind her. No one moved. No one cracked a joke. No one tried to fill the void with nervous laughter or casual conversation, because what had just happened wasn't simply a misunderstanding that had been corrected. It was a fundamental shift in how they understood the world around them, a recognition that they'd been operating with incomplete information and faulty assumptions. Hayes looked at the 3 younger men, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. "You're going to remember this morning for a long time," he said finally. "The question is whether you're going to learn from it or just file it away as an embarrassing story to tell your friends." He tucked his clipboard under his arm and headed toward the door. Next time you think you know what someone is capable of, based on how they look or how old they are, remember Sergeant Briggs. Remember those marks on her arms. And remember that the most dangerous people in the world are usually the ones who don't need to tell you how dangerous they are. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving the three men alone with their thoughts and the sudden understanding that they had just received an education that wasn't available in any manual or training program. Outside, Briggs walked across the parking lot toward her truck, the morning sun warming her back and casting long shadows across the asphalt. Behind her, Building 9 looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. But inside, three young soldiers were learning that appearances could be deceiving and that respect wasn't something you gave. It was something you earned, one quiet moment at a time. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered, and whether they chose to learn from it was up to them. Some lessons were like that. You could lead people to wisdom, but you couldn't make them think. But you could make sure they remembered the moment when they realized how much they didn't know. And sometimes that was enough. Ever met someone you completely misjudged? Someone who turned out to be carrying more than you could have imagined? What would you have done if you'd seen those burn marks? Would you have recognized them for what they really were? Let us know in the comments below. Hit that like button. If this story reminded you that quiet strength often runs deeper than loud confidence, subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss these powerful stories about the veterans who walk among us every day. Share this with someone who thinks they know what a warrior looks like. More stories like this are waiting for you. Check out our playlist and discover the heroes hiding in plain sight. We'll see you tomorrow, right here on Dignity Defended.